Sign it, Corinne.
No.
She already gave you an answer. Walk away, cowboy. This isn't your business.
I had him handled.
I know. That's why I noticed you.
He rode into town for flour and bullets. But the stranger standing in the mud with a spine made of iron changed everything he thought he knew about his life. Hit follow and turn on notifications so you don't miss a single chapter of this story. The town of Oakhaven smelled like burned coffee and horse sweat. Tristan Holt rode in just past mid-morning when the sun was high enough to bleach the color out of everything: the storefronts, the wagon boards, the faces of men leaning on posts with nothing particular to do. He kept his hat low and his eyes moving. Old habit. 13 years of living on the edge of danger had a way of making a man read a street the same way he'd read a battlefield. He wasn't looking for trouble. He was looking for flour. His list was simple and deliberate. 50 pounds of flour, black coffee, a salt lick for the cattle, and 2 boxes of 0.4 440 cartridges for his Winchester. Winter was still months out, but up on Blackwood Ridge, it came early and stayed long. A man who didn't prepare in summer didn't survive in February. He tied his horse at the rail outside the mercantile and swung down easy, rolling the stiffness out of his right knee, an old gift from a Confederate saber at Chickamauga. He didn't limp. He refused to. But some mornings, the joint reminded him it was still there, still holding the memory of that day. The town was busy enough. Women moved between storefronts with baskets on their arms. A freighter was unloading barrels of lamp oil. 2 boys chased a dog through the gap between the milliner's shop and the assayer's office. Tristan noticed all of it without appearing to notice any of it. He pushed through the mercantile door, nodded once at the man behind the counter, and began working through his list. Straightforward business. That was how he liked things. He was still waiting on the cartridges when he heard her voice outside. Not scared. That was the first thing he registered. The woman's voice wasn't begging or pleading. It was firm, and it was angry. And underneath the anger, there was something that refused to crack. Then he heard the second voice, heavier, oiled with self-satisfaction, and his jaw tightened. He knew that tone. He'd heard it on plantation owners before the war, on officers who wore their rank like a weapon. The tone of a man who had decided the outcome already and was simply enjoying the formality. Tristan set his cartridges on the counter, told the shopkeeper he'd be back for them, and walked outside. There were 5 of them, 4 hired hands forming a loose half-circle, and in the center of it all, a broad man in a dark wool coat and polished boots that had no business being that clean on a dirt street. Orville Buckner. Tristan had heard the name twice already since arriving in the valley. That was usually twice too many when a name kept coming up in the same breath as foreclosures and missing water rights. The woman stood her ground in front of him. She was maybe 5'4", with dark hair pinned up under a practical hat, ink stains on her right hand, and a leather ledger pressed against her chest like a shield. She was young, maybe mid-20s, but she held herself like someone who had long since decided that her spine was not negotiable. Buckner's man reached out and grabbed the ledger from her hands, just took it. The way men like that do things casually, because they've never once faced a real consequence. He held it open, scanning the pages with mock interest. And then he tore 3 pages loose and let them fall into the mud. The woman watched the pages drop. Her face didn't crumble. Her jaw set harder. "You will sign the deed transfer," Buckner said pleasantly, "and the marriage contract. Both today. Or the bank calls your note at close of business and you are on the street by sundown." He tilted his head slightly, studying her. "I am being generous, Miss Mercer. I would recognize that if I were you. A man with money might buy paper debts, Mr. Buckner," she said, "but he will never own a human soul, nor can he steal knowledge from a child's mind." Buckner's smile stayed fixed, but something moved behind his eyes. He didn't like that. Men like him never did being answered instead of obeyed. Tristan walked forward. He didn't announce himself. He didn't raise his voice. He moved through the half-circle of hired hands, the way smoke moves through a doorway, quiet, inevitable, and impossible to grab hold of. He stopped about 4 feet from Buckner, positioned so his right hand hung naturally near the grip of the Colt on his hip. He looked at each of the 4 men in turn. Slow, measuring. Then he looked at Buckner. The click of the Colt's hammer being drawn back was very loud in the sudden quiet. He hadn't drawn the gun. He hadn't needed to. Just the sound of it. Just the deliberate mechanical certainty of it. And the 4 hired hands found other directions to look. Business concluded, Tristan said. His voice was low and conversational, the kind that didn't require volume to carry weight. Buckner's jaw worked. He wanted to push back. Tristan could see that calculation happening behind his eyes, the arithmetic of risk and reward. But he also saw the answer Buckner arrived at, because he'd seen that particular look before too. Men who start the math and don't like where it ends. We'll revisit this, Buckner said to the woman, as though Tristan weren't standing there at all. I imagine you'll try, Tristan replied. Buckner turned and walked away. His men followed. They didn't hurry, because men like that never hurried where people could see them. But they went, and the street breathed again. Tristan released the hammer, slow and deliberate, and turned his attention to the ground. The torn pages from the ledger were scattered across the mud figures and columns, names of students, dates of lessons, all of it written in a precise, careful hand. He crouched and picked them up one at a time, shaking the worst of the grime off. The ink had run in places, but most of it was still readable. He stood and held the pages out. The woman took them from his hand. Her fingers were steady. There was a moment, just a breath of one, where the backs of her ink-stained knuckles brushed across his scarred ones. She didn't remark on the scars. He didn't remark on the fact that her hands weren't shaking. Corinne Mercer, she said. Schoolteacher. Tristan Holt. He retrieved the remaining pages from the mud. She looked at the pages, then at him. Composing herself, maybe, or just deciding what the next practical step was. He got the impression she was always doing that, not wasting time on what couldn't be changed, moving immediately to what could. Thank you, she said. Though I want you to know I was managing. Yes, he said. I could see that. He meant it without irony. And something in his plain delivery seemed to register with her, because she looked at him differently then. Not softened, exactly. Reassessing. He gathered the last few pages and handed them over. Her ledger was back under her arm. Around them, the street had resumed its business, the freighter with his barrels, the boys with their dog, the ordinary noise of an ordinary day, as though 5 men surrounding a woman in the middle of the road had been nothing remarkable. That bothered Tristan more than the 5 men had. He touched the brim of his hat. She nodded once, precise and serious, and turned to gather the books that had spilled from her bag onto the boardwalk. He watched her square her shoulders and walk back toward the building, with the hand-painted sign above the door. Oakhaven Public Library, free use for all. He stood there for a moment in the sunlight. Flour, coffee, salt lick, cartridges. He still had a list to fill. He turned and pushed back through the mercantile door, and behind him, Oakhaven went back to its regular noise, and nobody said a word about what had just happened on its main street in broad daylight. But Tristan Holt was thinking about ink-stained hands, and torn pages rescued from the mud, and a woman who answered a threat with a sentence about human dignity instead of running. He thought about that for a while. Outside, above the library door, a thin banner shifted in the afternoon wind. He had to concentrate to make the letters out, had to break them apart the way he always did, the way that shamed him when anyone was watching. He read it slowly. The word free he knew, and all. He stood there one moment longer. Then he went back to his list. The blizzard came out of nowhere. That was the thing about late spring in Montana territory. You could have 3 warm days in a row, wildflowers pushing up through the mud, cattle moving easy across the pasture, and then the sky would just turn. No warning. The temperature dropped 15 degrees in an hour, and by nightfall, the wind was driving sideways down the main street of Oakhaven, hard enough to sting bare skin like thrown gravel. Tristan had been planning to ride out by late afternoon. He hadn't. His horse wasn't built for a mountain pass in a whiteout, and neither was the loaded wagon. He knew better than to fight weather on its own terms. So he'd done what any sensible man did. He'd secured the horse in the livery, paid for a room at Widow Finch's boarding house, and accepted that the Ridge would have to wait one more day. The boarding house was warm, at least. Martha Finch ran a tight operation. Good lamp oil, a wood stove that actually drew right, and a rule against boots on her furniture that she enforced with the kind of quiet authority that made grown men comply without quite knowing how it happened. She was somewhere past 60, with sharp eyes and silver hair pinned back without ceremony, and she had apparently decided, within about 4 minutes of Tristan's arrival, that she approved of him. "You're the one who stepped in for Corinne Mercer this afternoon," she said, setting a bowl of beef stew in front of him. He hadn't confirmed or denied it. She'd taken that as confirmation. "Good," she said, and left him to his dinner. He ate alone at the long table, listening to the storm work itself against the windows. 2 other travelers were stranded in the house, a drummer from Helena with a case full of patent medicines, and an older rancher from the South Valley who'd been in town for supplies, same as Tristan. Both men had gone to their rooms early. Tristan was still at the table when the knock came at his door. Not his room door, the door to the small sitting room off the main hall, where he'd retreated with a second cup of coffee after supper. A quiet knock, deliberate, not nervous, but not assuming either. He opened the door. Corinne Mercer stood in the hallway with her ledger under her arm, and her hair still pinned but beginning to loosen around the edges, like the day had slowly been taking it apart. She'd changed out of her muddy coat into a plain wool dress, dark gray, practical. She looked like someone who had spent the last several hours thinking very hard about something and had finally arrived at a decision. "Mr. Holt," she said, "I'd like to speak with you, if you have a few minutes." He stepped back from the door and gestured at the 2 chairs by the stove. She came in and sat down in the one closest to the heat, setting her ledger on her knee with both hands flat on top of it. He took the other chair and waited. She didn't waste time with preamble. "I have a proposition," she said. "A business one. I want to be clear about that up front, all right?" She opened the ledger to a page she'd already marked. Neat columns of figures, everything precise and annotated. "My father died 6 weeks ago. He was a surveyor good at his work, but not at managing his own finances. He left behind a mortgage note on our property, $250, due in full in 48 hours. She turned the ledger so he could see the numbers. "Buckner's been buying up debt notes around the valley. He purchased mine from the bank 3 weeks ago. This morning was his 3rd visit. The marriage contract he mentioned is genuine. It's his preferred method for acquiring land when he can't get the deed outright. He gets both the property and the legal cover of a compliant wife." Tristan looked at the figures. He could follow numbers well enough. It was the words around them that gave him trouble. "You're not going to sign it," he said. "No," she said. "Obviously not. So what are you proposing?" She held his gaze. "Steady, I noticed something at the Mercantile this afternoon, before everything happened outside. You were at the counter with the freight receipts and the land tax notices, and you were..." She paused, choosing the word carefully. Having difficulty, the muscle in his jaw moved. Just once. She didn't flinch from it. "I'm not saying that to embarrass you, Mr. Holt. I'm saying it because it's relevant to what I'm about to offer." He didn't say anything. She took that as permission to continue. "I'm proposing a marriage of convenience," she said. "Legal, documented, and strictly a business arrangement. 2 years. Here are the terms as I see them." She turned to another page. "You pay the $250 note. That clears my debt and removes any legal claim Buckner holds over the property. In exchange, for the duration of 2 years, I manage your ranch ledgers and all your legal paperwork contracts, tax filings, land records, correspondence. I'll also teach you to read and write." She said that last part the same way she said everything else. Plainly, without apology for it. Full literacy. Enough to manage your own affairs without depending on anyone else. The fire in the stove popped. Outside, the blizzard pushed hard against the glass. Tristan had spent 11 years making sure nobody knew about the reading. He'd built systems around it, paying men he trusted to handle paperwork, memorizing rather than reading, using his finger to follow lines of text, slowly enough that most people assumed he was being thorough rather than struggling. It was the one wound he'd never let anyone see, because wounds were leverage, and leverage in the wrong hands was dangerous. This woman had seen it in an afternoon. He should have been angry about that. He sat with the feeling for a moment, checking it. No, what he actually felt underneath the instinct to deny was something closer to tired. Tired of the systems. Tired of the careful management of an ordinary limitation that had followed him since childhood. 2 years, he said. 2 years, she confirmed. At the end of which, we file for legal dissolution on grounds of mutual agreement. Territorial law allows it. I've checked. She turned 2 more pages. I've already drafted the terms. You can have them reviewed by whoever you trust. He almost said something then, almost told her that reviewing documents was the precise problem. He didn't. "Why me?" he asked instead. "You met me 4 hours ago, because you stepped in this afternoon when you didn't have to," she said, "because you didn't make a show of it afterward. And because Buckner has enough political reach in this territory that I need a legal arrangement he can't unwind with a bribe. A documented marriage to a property-owning rancher strips him of every claim he holds." She met his eyes. "And because you're already planning to leave tomorrow, and I need this settled before the deadline expires." Tristan looked at the fire for a moment. He was 34 years old. He'd survived a war that had killed better men than him. He'd built a ranch in the mountains with his own hands, run cattle through winters that tested every skill he had, and kept himself alive through sheer competent stubbornness for 6 years of isolation. He was not a man who made decisions based on sentiment. He looked at the columns of figures she'd laid out, tidy, thorough, with the kind of precision that only came from genuine understanding. He thought about 6 years of ranch ledgers managed by guesswork and a hired hand whose arithmetic was unreliable. He thought about the land tax notice he'd held that morning and been unable to read without moving his lips and hoping nobody noticed. He thought about this woman standing in the mud with her spine straight and saying a man with money could not own a human soul. 2 conditions, he said. She nodded once, pen already in hand. "The arrangement is private. Nobody's business what the terms are." "Agreed. And you and anyone in your care are safe on my land." "That's not a term of the contract. That's just a fact I'm establishing." She looked up from the ledger. Something shifted. In her expression, not surprise exactly, but a recalculation. Like she'd prepared for negotiation and gotten something else. "Agreed," she said again, quieter. He reached across and signed the contract, where she'd marked the line. His signature was slow and deliberate, each letter formed with concentration. She watched him do it without comment. She countersigned below him in a quick, practiced hand. "There's one more thing," she said, when she closed the ledger. "Before we leave tomorrow, I need to make a stop." "Where?" She told him about Toby. Tristan listened to the whole of it, without interrupting the boy's father, the debt that had transferred to the son, the ironworks, the chains. By the time she finished, the coffee in his cup had gone cold. "How old?" he asked. 11. The fire popped again. He looked at it for a long time. "We'll go first thing," he said. She nodded, stood and tucked the ledger under her arm. At the door, she paused and turned back. "Thank you, Mr. Holt, for this afternoon. And for this, Tristan," he said. She considered that for a brief moment. "Corinne?" she replied. Then she was gone down the hall, and he was alone with the storm again, and the cooling coffee, and the weight of a signed contract that had changed the shape of whatever tomorrow was going to look like. He didn't sleep much that night, but then he rarely did. He spent the hours before dawn, sitting by the window, watching snow pile against the glass, running through the practical logistics of what he'd agreed to. Space in the cabin. Supplies for 3 instead of 1. The addition he'd been meaning to build for 2 years and hadn't because there'd been no reason. There was a reason now. He wasn't a man who believed much in providence or signs or the hand of God arranging circumstances. He believed in work and in decisions made with clear eyes and in honoring what you'd put your name to. He'd put his name to it. That was enough. By the time the storm began to ease and the first gray light came over the eastern ridge, Tristan Holt had already made his peace with the situation and moved on to planning. That was another old habit. Once a thing was decided, you didn't linger over the deciding. You looked forward, identified the next obstacle, and figured out how to clear it. The next obstacle was a locked ironworks and a boy in chains. He started getting ready. Buckner's Ironworks sat at the north end of Oakhaven, past the last of the proper storefronts, in the part of town where the ground was always darker, and the air carried the sour bite of coal smoke and hot iron. The blizzard had left everything crusted in thin ice overnight, and the morning was the pale, brittle kind that comes after unexpected cold sky, washed, clean and blue ground, glittering, every sound carrying farther than it should. Their boots crunched on the frozen mud as they walked. Corinne's breath came in small white puffs. She walked fast, chin up, ledger under her arm again. She'd explained Toby's situation over breakfast quickly, efficiently, the way she seemed to handle everything. The boy's father had borrowed from Buckner 18 months ago. A small loan, $40, to cover a medical bill. He'd died before repaying it, and Buckner had moved the debt to the son under a labor indenture contract that was, technically, legal under a loose reading of territorial law. Toby worked 12-hour days at the forge. He'd been doing it for 4 months. "He's 11, Tristan said again when she finished. Yes, he didn't say anything else. But when they rounded the corner and the ironworks came into view, a low timber building with a wide door standing open and the orange light of the forge already burning inside his pace didn't slow, and his expression settled into something very quiet and very deliberate. The man at the front of the shop was one of Buckner's, wide through the shoulders, with the look of someone whose primary job was discouraging questions. He stepped into the doorway when he saw them coming and crossed his arms. "Shop's not open for customers yet," he said. "I'm not a customer," Tristan said. He walked past the man the same way he'd walked through the hired hands in the street the day before. Not aggressively, not with any particular display, just with the complete and obvious absence of any intention to stop. The man at the door made a calculation, glanced at the Colt on Tristan's hip, and stepped back. Inside, the forge was already going full. The heat was intense after the cold outside, thick, wavering air that smelled of coal and iron filings and the sweat of hard labor. 2 adult workers were at the bellows on the far side, and near the center of the room, at the anvil, was a boy. He was small for 11, lean in the way of children who don't get enough to eat, with dark hair matted to his forehead from the heat. He wore a leather apron that was too large for him, the straps knotted up to keep it from dragging the floor. His hands were already calloused and scarred in a way that no child's hands should be, and around his left ankle, attached to a chain bolted into the floor, was an iron cuff. He didn't look up when they came in. He was shaping a piece of stock iron, hammer coming down in the practiced rhythm of someone who had learned the work whether they wanted to or not. Corinne's hand tightened on her ledger. She didn't make a sound. Tristan looked at the chain for about 2 seconds. Then he crossed the room to the rear office, where Buckner's overseer, a thin man with ink-stained fingers, and the harried look of someone managing accounts for a person they feared, was sitting behind a desk stacked with papers. The man looked up. "This is a private, the Mercer debt note," Tristan said. "What's the full balance?" The man blinked. I, the mercer, the banknote. What's the outstanding balance? The man shuffled through his papers with suddenly unsteady hands. $250. But Mr. Buckner has already. That note was cleared this morning. Corinne stepped into the doorway behind Tristan. The payment was made to the Territorial Bank at opening. You can send a rider to confirm. She opened her ledger and produced a receipt, setting it on the desk in front of the man. That obligation is discharged. The man looked at the receipt. Looked at her. Looked at Tristan, the boy. Tristan said, Toby. His father's debt. What is the remaining balance? More shuffling. $32. But the indenture contract runs through. $50, Tristan said, and he took the money from his coat pocket and put it on the desk. 5 $10 banknotes, laid down one at a time, flat and deliberate. That covers the debt and buys out the remainder of the contract. Territorial law allows debt satisfaction as grounds for indenture termination. You know it does. The overseer looked at the money. He wanted to argue Tristan could see that, but the argument required a backbone that the man didn't appear to have on hand. He looked at the $50 and at the receipt Corinne had placed next to it, and at Tristan's face, and he made the reasonable decision. I'll need to draw up a release form, he said quietly. Draw it up, Tristan said. It took 20 minutes. Tristan stood without moving while it was done, which had the additional effect of making the process go faster than it might have otherwise. Corinne reviewed every line of the document before either of them signed it. She caught 2 errors, one a simple mistake, one less simple, and had the man correct both before she would accept the paper. When it was done, she took the release form, folded it, and placed it in her ledger. They walked back out to the forge floor together. The boy still hadn't stopped working. The hammer was still coming down, steady and mechanical, the rhythm of someone who had learned that stopping attracted attention. Corinne crouched down beside the anvil. Toby. The hammer paused. He looked up. He had a watchful face, the kind of watchfulness that children develop when the adults around them are unpredictable. Dark eyes, a cut healing above his left eyebrow, and an expression that was trying very hard not to show hope, because hope was the thing that hurt worst when it didn't pay out. We have a release form, Corinne said. She kept her voice even and clear. It's been signed. Your debt is paid. She showed him the paper without handing it over, so he could see it was real. You're done here. The boy looked at the paper, then at her, then at Tristan, who was standing behind Corinne with his arms at his sides. Who are you? Toby asked, looking at Tristan. Tristan Holt. I run a cattle spread up on Blackwood Ridge. Toby's eyes dropped to the colt on his hip, back up to his face. You a lawman? No. Then why'd you pay for me? Tristan considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. Because it was right, he said, and because it was $40. The boy almost smiled. He didn't quite make it, but he almost did. The overseer came out from the back office with a key and bent down and unlocked the cuff. It fell away from Toby's ankle and hit the floor with a sound that was too heavy for such a small piece of iron. Toby stood up and immediately took one step away from where it had been, like the ground around it, had become something he didn't want to touch. He looked at his ankle for a moment, then at Corinne, then at Tristan. What happens now? He asked. Now, Corinne said, you come with us. They left the ironworks with Toby walking between them, carrying nothing but the clothes on his back. Because the clothes on his back were apparently all he had. Corinne set her hand briefly on his shoulder as they stepped out into the cold morning air. He didn't pull away, which she seemed to take as a good sign. He was squinting in the sunlight, having apparently spent most of his recent days in the orange dark of the forge, and he kept close to the 2 adults in the uncalculated way of a child who has learned that adults in your corner are a resource you don't waste. The ceremony was at the magistrate's office, which was 3 doors past the courthouse on the north side of the street. Tristan had arranged it the night before, through Widow Finch, who apparently knew everyone, and had strong opinions about Buckner that she was willing to express in the form of practical assistance. The magistrate was a compact man named Aldridge, with spectacles and the patient expression of someone who had officiated many frontier arrangements of a practical nature. He had a fire going in the small office's stove and a witness, one of his clerks, already waiting by the window. There was no wedding gown, no church bells, no flowers. Corinne wore the same dark wool dress she'd had on that morning. Tristan wore what he always wore, canvas trousers, work shirt, leather vest, his coat against the cold. Toby stood to one side, still slightly dazed, watching the proceedings with the solemn attention of a child, who understood he was witnessing something significant without fully grasping the details. Magistrate Aldridge read through the legal language in a brisk, businesslike manner. Tristan listened to each line. Corinne listened with her eyes on the magistrate, hands clasped in front of her, her posture the same as it had been since the moment he'd met her, straight, deliberate, certain. When Aldridge asked the necessary questions, they both answered clearly and without hesitation. Aldridge had them sign the register. Corinne's signature quick and sure, Tristan's measured and careful. The clerk countersigned. Aldridge stamped the document, dated it, and handed Tristan the certificate. "Congratulations," Aldridge said, with the kind of warmth that suggested he genuinely meant it, despite having performed the ceremony in under 5 minutes. Tristan folded the certificate and put it in his inside coat pocket. They walked back out into the morning. Neither of them spoke for a moment. The street was coming alive with the regular business of the day: voices, wagon wheels, a dog barking somewhere near the livery. Toby looked up at both of them. "Are you married now?" "Yes," Corinne said. He took that in. "Is that why he paid for me?" "He paid for you before the wedding," she said. Toby said, like that was an important distinction to record. Tristan had already turned toward the livery, because the wagon still needed loading, and the pass would only be clear for another few hours before the afternoon clouds came back in. "We leave in 1 hour," he said, over his shoulder. "Toby, do you know horses?" the boy said, falling into step behind him with the rapid adaptability of a child who had learned to adjust quickly to new circumstances. "I know donkeys better. We had a donkey before my dad. He stopped. Before." "Donkeys are harder," Tristan said. "Horses will be simple by comparison." Toby thought about this seriously. "All right," he said. Corinne watched them walk toward the livery together. The big, quiet man and the thin, watchful boy, and stood in the cold morning street for one moment alone. She let out a slow, deliberate breath, watching it cloud and dissolve in the air. Then she went back to Widow Finch's boarding house to collect her trunk, her books, and the carefully folded survey maps her father had left her, which she had looked at every day for 6 weeks without fully understanding what they meant. She was beginning to understand. By mid-morning, the wagon was loaded: provisions, Corinne's trunk, a small bag for Toby, Tristan's provisions underneath it all. Widow Finch came out to the street to see them off, pressed a wrapped bundle of cornbread into Toby's hands, and told Tristan, with perfect frankness, that he'd done a decent thing twice in 2 days, and she hoped it was habit-forming. He thanked her, without quite knowing what to do with that, and she seemed to find his discomfort satisfying. They were 2 miles out of Oak Haven, moving up the switchback road toward the ridge, when Buckner's wagon came down the opposite side and passed them in the road. Buckner sat in the driver's seat with his 2 remaining townside men, and he watched them pass with eyes that were flat and very still. He didn't stop. He didn't say anything. But his gaze moved from Tristan to Corinne to the boy, and then back to Tristan, and in it was the particular quality of a man who has recalculated his plans rather than abandoned them. Tristan held the reins, steady, and kept his eyes on the road ahead. Behind him, Corinne sat, with her hand resting on the survey maps in her lap, watching the valley fall away below them as the wagon climbed. And Toby sat between them, eating cornbread and looking at the mountains with an expression that was very new on his face. It looked something like the beginning of relief. The cabin appeared through the pines, just as the last daylight was draining out of the sky. Tristan had pushed the horses hard on the upper switchbacks, watching the clouds build to the west, and reading them the way he read most things, by instinct and experience rather than any written record. They had maybe 40 minutes before the temperature dropped again. He'd made it with 20 to spare. Blackwood Ridge sat high, and apart from the valley, accessible by one decent road and two trails that only made sense if you already knew they were there. The timber was dense. Up here, old-growth ponderosa pine with trunks wide as wagon wheels, standing so close together in places that the afternoon light came through in strips. The air was different, thinner, colder, and cleaner, carrying the smell of pine resin and creek water and the particular mineral sharpness of high-altitude stone. The cabin itself was solid. That was the first word that came to Corinne as they rounded the last bend, and it came into view. Not pretty, not welcoming, not anything that invited a second adjective. Just solid. Heavy log construction, well chinked, with a stone chimney at the east end and a covered porch running the full width of the front. A barn stood 50 yards to the north, connected to the cabin by a roofed breezeway. A split-rail fence ran the perimeter of the yard, and beyond it, the pasture dropped away toward a creek that she could hear but not see in the fading light. A man had built this alone. She could tell that too, somehow in the practical decisions made at every turn, the absence of any ornamentation, the structural choices that prioritized durability over appearance. Every log seated for longevity, every corner squared for function. Toby was asleep against her shoulder. He'd been asleep for the last hour of the ride, swaying with the wagon, without waking, his cornbread finished long since, one hand still loosely gripping the board seat, even in sleep. She kept her shoulders steady. Tristan stopped the wagon in front of the barn, climbed down, and began unhitching the horses without preamble. Corinne transferred Toby carefully from her shoulder to the wagon bed, letting him settle against her trunk. He stirred once, murmured something, and went back under. She climbed down and stood in the yard. The wind was moving through the pine tops above them, a long, low sound, constant and deep. An owl called somewhere to the north. The creek was louder now, just audible, over the horses shifting in their traces. She looked at the cabin. Dark windows, cold hearth. 6 years of a man living alone, and every surface inside would reflect exactly that. She picked up her smallest bag and went to find the door. Inside, it was exactly what she expected, and nothing worse. A single large room, hearth and cook space on the east wall. A rough table with 2 chairs, a row of iron hooks by the door holding a rain slicker, and 2 coils of rope. A wooden bench along the north wall. One door at the back, leading to what she assumed was the bedroom. Shelves with provisions, flour, salt, dried beans, stacked with the precise, joyless efficiency of a man who stocked for survival rather than comfort. No curtains, no rug, one oil lamp on the table, unlit. She found flint and steel on the mantel and lit the lamp. Then she built a fire in the hearth from the wood stacked beside it. Good dry pine, split to the right size, and she was pleased to find she still remembered how from summers at her father's survey camps. The fire caught quickly. The room began to shift, in tone almost immediately, the cold retreating from the corners as the light grew. Tristan came in from the barn while she was filling the kettle from the water barrel in the corner. He stopped just inside the door and looked at the fire. Something moved across his face, she couldn't name it exactly, but it was brief and unguarded, and he seemed to realize that almost immediately, because his expression went back to its regular, controlled flatness. "Bedroom's through there," he said. "You and the boy take it. I'll sleep out here." She turned from the kettle. "There's a bench. I've slept on worse." That, she believed completely. She didn't argue. She went and looked at the bedroom. A rope bed with a wool blanket, folded military crisp at the foot. A small window facing east. A wooden crate serving as a side table, with a stub of candle on it. It was spare, but it was private, and she appreciated both. Tristan brought Toby in from the wagon without waking him, settled the boy on the bed with the kind of careful Economical competence that suggested he had more experience with the unconscious and injured than with sleeping children, and pulled the blanket up to his chin. Toby didn't stir through any of it. Corinne set her trunk against the wall, lit the candle, and came back out to the main room where Tristan was at the hearth with his back to her, hanging a pot for coffee. "Boundaries," she said from across the room. He turned. "We should be clear about them," she said, "for the sake of efficiency." He set the pot on the hook, turned to face her with his arms at his sides. "Go ahead. The bedroom stays private. Yours, mine, or the boys' depending on need. The rest of the house is shared working space." She kept her voice matter-of-fact. "I won't interfere with your ranch operations unless you ask me to. I will manage the books, the correspondence, and the legal filings. I'll keep the house functional." She paused. "And the lessons. 3 times a week to start, more when you have time." He nodded once. "What do you need from me?" she asked. He thought about it for a moment, genuinely thought about it. Which she was already learning was characteristic of him. He didn't answer quickly, and when he answered, it was worth hearing. "Honesty," he said. "If something on this spread isn't right, tell me directly. I don't have patience for working around things." "Neither do I," she said. "Then we'll get along." He poured her coffee when it was ready. They sat at the opposite ends of the rough table and talked through the practical schedule cattle rotation, fence lines, what the ledgers looked like when the tax notices were due. She wrote notes in the margin of her ledger. He answered everything she asked with precision and detail, and she noticed that when he talked about the ranch, he was different, less guarded, more open, the way any person is when the subject under discussion is something they have mastered and genuinely care about. They didn't talk about anything else. By 9 o'clock, she had 4 pages of notes, a general picture of the ranch's operations, and a growing suspicion that his accounts had not been properly managed in at least 2 years. She didn't say so yet. She'd need to see the actual figures first. She said good night and went to the bedroom. She heard him bank the fire and settle onto the bench, and that was the last thing she heard before exhaustion took her. 3 nights later, the storm came. Not a blizzard this time, a genuine late spring thunderstorm. The kind that rolled off the eastern mountains with almost no warning. All electricity and cold rain and wind that hit the cabin in gusts, strong enough to flex the shutters. Corinne was still awake, reviewing the ranch ledgers by candlelight while Toby slept behind her when the thunder began. The first rolls were distant. By the time the lightning was striking close enough to light the window white every few minutes, she heard Tristan get up from the bench. She listened. He didn't come to the bedroom door. He didn't make any sound she could identify as distress. But she had grown up reading people her father's survey crew, her students, the families who came to the library, and there was a quality to the silence from the main room that was different from ordinary wakefulness. She got up. He was sitting at the table with his hands flat on the surface in front of him, not holding anything, not doing anything, just sitting. His eyes were open, his jaw was set. A vein moved in his neck with each heartbeat, slightly too fast. He heard her in the doorway and looked up. His face went controlled immediately, but she'd already seen what was underneath it. Not fear exactly, but a man fighting something interior with every tool he had and holding on by will alone. She didn't ask what was wrong. She didn't say anything at all. She went to the hearth and put the kettle on. She found the dried chamomile she'd brought in her trunk and tucked into the kitchen shelf 3 days ago, and she made a cup of tea. She brought it to the table and set it beside his right hand. Then she went and sat in the chair at the opposite end of the table, turned slightly away from him, and went back to reading the ledger. Lightning hit somewhere close. The cabin shuddered with the thunder that followed immediately after. She kept her eyes on the page. After a while, she heard him pick up the cup. He didn't speak. She didn't require him to. She stayed at the table, reading her numbers, making occasional small notes while the storm hammered the ridge, and gradually, incrementally began to spend itself. The gaps between lightning and thunder lengthened. The gusts spaced further apart. At some point, she looked up and found the tea gone, and his hands no longer pressed flat on the table. He was sitting back now. His breathing had changed. She closed the ledger. "Good night," she said. "Good night," he said. His voice was slightly rougher than usual. She went back to the bedroom and lay in the dark, listening to the rain ease from a roar to a murmur to a quiet, steady sound against the roof. She thought about the look on his face when she'd come out. The absolute, ferocious effort of a man who has learned to carry something alone for so long that he's forgotten there might be another way. She thought about all her students, the ones who came in having already decided they were stupid because no one had bothered to show them otherwise yet. That same lockdown posture, that same wary pride. She fell asleep thinking about that, and about the ledger numbers, and about the fact that she'd need to find him a brass hurricane lantern. A week after arriving, she found one in a crate in the barn, under a canvas tarpaulin, well made, in need of nothing but cleaning. The glass was smoky with soot. She carried it in, spent an afternoon with a rag and a small brush cleaning every surface until the brass gleamed, and put fresh oil in the reservoir. That night, when Tristan went out for his late boundary patrol, he went every night, in weather or clear, checking the fence lines and the cattle, with the regularity of a man who had learned that preparation was the only reliable defense against disaster. She set the lantern on the front window sill and lit it. She went back to her work. Toby was already asleep. An hour later, she heard boots on the porch. The door opened, and Tristan came in with rain on his coat and mud on his boots, and he stopped just inside the door in the way he'd stopped that first night when she'd had the fire going. He looked at the lantern in the window. She didn't comment on it. She just looked up from her ledger, noted that he was back, and returned to the column of figures she was working through. But she saw his face in the moment before he thought to arrange it, and she understood. 6 years alone on a ridge meant 6 years of walking back to a dark window, and whatever that did to a person over time, it had done it to him. He hung up his coat. He came and sat at the table. She pushed the coffee pot toward him without looking up. From across the table, she heard him exhale, long and quiet, most of the cold in the night coming out of him at once. She kept her eyes on the numbers, but she reached the end of that column with a particular sense of something settled correctly, and she allowed herself, privately, to count it as a good day's work. Summer came to Blackwood Ridge, the way it always does at elevation slowly, then all at once. One week, the creek was still running high with snowmelt, the mornings bitter enough to see breath before 8 o'clock, the ground hard and unforgiving underfoot. Then something shifted in the air, some invisible balance tipped, and suddenly the meadow past the south fence was knee-high in grass. The creek had settled to its summer murmur, and the sky was doing that particular deep Montana blue that went on forever in every direction. Toby discovered that he liked being outside. This had not been apparent in the first 2 weeks, when he'd stayed close to the cabin, and close to Corinne, watching Tristan with the careful attention of a child, still running calculations about whether the situation was as stable as it appeared. He helped with small tasks carrying wood, filling the water barrel, feeding the chickens. Tristan kept in a coop behind the barn. He was useful and quiet and very observant, and he ate everything put in front of him with the thoroughness of a boy who had learned not to count on the next meal. Gradually, over the course of 3 weeks, the calculations apparently resolved in Tristan's favor. One morning, Toby simply followed him out to the barn without being asked and spent the morning learning how to muck a stall properly. Tristan showed him once, clearly and without condescension, and then let him do it. That was, Corinne observed from the kitchen window, the beginning of things between them. She was discovering a great deal about Tristan Holt from the ranch ledgers. The books were a document of a man's choices, and his choices told a story. He had been meticulous about the cattle bloodlines, weights, purchase, and sale prices recorded in someone else's handwriting up until 2 years ago. Then increasingly sparse entries in Tristan's own slow, careful hand, full of abbreviated words and creative spelling, but always with the numbers right. The numbers were always right. He had a natural precision with figures that had never required reading to develop. What the books also revealed was that a local merchant named Greer had been overcharging him on freight deliveries for at least 18 months. Not dramatically, just $1 here, $2 there, the kind of discrepancy easy to miss if you weren't comparing receipts against the original contracted rate. Over 18 months, it added up to considerably more than $1 or $2. Corinne pulled every receipt, laid them against the contracted rates, and spent 2 evenings building a complete record of the discrepancy. She put the figures in front of Tristan on a Thursday evening and pointed to the bottom line. He looked at the numbers for a long moment. His jaw tightened slightly. "How much?" he said. "In total, over the 18 months I can document. $230. He sat back, said nothing for a moment. "That's almost what we paid for the banknote." "Yes," she said. "Can we recover it?" "With documented evidence and a letter to the Territorial Trade Office, yes. Probably most of it." She tapped the top of the stack. "I've already drafted the letter. I just need your signature." He looked at the letter. She watched the familiar concentration move across his face as he read it through slow, deliberate finger, moving fractionally along each line. He'd been getting faster. She tracked his progress the way she tracked all her students, watching for the specific points where fluency broke down so she could address them directly, rather than generally. He found 2 words he didn't know and asked her what they were. She told him without any surrounding commentary. He read the rest, nodded, and signed. "Good," she said, and put the letter in the correspondence folder. The lessons had settled into Tuesday and Thursday evenings and Sunday mornings, at the table by the lamp. She'd started where she always started with adult learners, sounds before letters, patterns before rules, building confidence through small, achievable steps before introducing complexity. He was a good student in the specific way that adults who have managed without something for a long time are good at it, focused, serious, unwilling to move forward until he understood a thing completely. Pride was both his obstacle and his engine. She worked with it rather than against it. 3 weeks in, she put a land contract in front of him, the actual lease agreement for his eastern grazing rights, which came up for renewal in the fall. "Read me what you can," she said. He read it, slowly, with 2 stops for clarification, and 1 long pause over a word he finally worked out on his own. But he read it. When he was done, he sat for a moment looking at the page. "The renewal clause," he said, on page 2. "Greer's brother owns the land." She'd noticed that too. She hadn't said so. "Go on," she said. "If Greer's been skimming my freight costs, his brother may be doing the same on the lease terms. I want to compare this against what the other ranchers in the valley are paying per acre." She looked at him for a moment. "That's exactly right," she said. He looked briefly, sharply uncomfortable with the praise. She filed that away and moved on, because she'd learned that with him, the most useful thing was to keep moving. Toby's education happened differently outside, mostly in the margins of work and motion. Tristan had a way of teaching by doing that her formal methods couldn't replicate. She watched it happen over those early summer weeks, the 2 of them in the yard or on the pasture. Tristan demonstrating something once with his full attention on making it clear, then handing it over and stepping back. He never did the thing for the boy twice. He trusted Toby to work it out, and Toby, responding to that trust with the intensity of a child starved for it, generally did. The desk appeared one morning in mid-June. Corinne came out of the bedroom at first light to find it standing against the east wall, a small writing desk, clearly hand-built, with a smooth, plain surface and a shelf below for books. The proportions were exactly right for an 11-year-old. The joinery at the corners was neat and tight. Someone had worked on it for a long time. She looked at Tristan, who was at the hearth with his back to the room. He didn't say anything about the desk. She looked at it for another moment, running her hand along the smooth surface. "Toby," she called toward the bedroom. "Come and see." The boy appeared in the doorway, half-dressed, squinting against the morning light. He saw the desk and went completely still. He walked to it slowly, put both hands flat on the surface, looked at the shelf, looked at Tristan's back. "That mine?" he asked. "You're the only one here who needs one," Tristan said to the fire. Toby stood there for a moment. His throat moved. Then he sat down at it, deliberately, with a 9-year-old solemnity, put his elbows on the surface, and looked at Corinne. "Can we start the lesson now?" She laughed, really laughed, and went to get his primer. The bow appeared 2 weeks later. Smaller than Tristan's own, sized for a boy's draw weight, with careful notching at the grip, and a bowstring that Tristan had waxed 3 times to get the tension right. He walked Toby out to the edge of the tree line on a Saturday morning, set up a burlap target against a pine trunk, and spent 2 hours teaching him the proper stance. Corinne watched from the porch, ostensibly reviewing correspondence. Toby missed the target 23 times before he hit it. She counted. When he did, when the arrow finally found the burlap and stuck there, he spun around with an expression of pure unguarded joy and looked at Tristan, who was standing 10 feet behind him with his arms crossed. Tristan nodded once. "Again," he said. "From the beginning, stance first." The joy settled into determination. Toby knocked another arrow. She went back to her correspondence, but she was smiling at the page. The horseback lessons came next, every morning for 2 weeks. Tristan led a steady quarter horse named Clover around the yard with Toby in the saddle, teaching him balance before movement, movement before speed. He had a quiet way, with both the horse and the boy, unhurried, clear, patient, in the specific way of a man who understood that rushing the foundation was how you built something that fell down later. One evening, after Toby had gone to bed, Tristan came in from a late check of the south fence and found Corinne at the table with a letter from one of the Valley families, a rancher, asking if she could take on their youngest boy as a student, since the nearest schoolhouse was 12 miles down the road. He read the letter over her shoulder. She'd gotten used to him doing that, coming to read things near her, without making a formal request of it, using the proximity as cover for the practice. She never remarked on it. "You going to do it?" he asked. "I'd like to, if you don't mind the company." He was quiet for a moment. "The boy, is he from Dunnell's outfit?" "I think so. Dunnell lost his wife last year. Boy's been home alone most days. He moved away to the Hook for his coat. Tell him yes." She wrote the letter. As she was folding it, she heard Tristan sit down on the bench, and then, unexpected, his voice again. "The Greer business," he said. "What you did with those receipts. Cross-checking everything, finding what nobody else found." He paused. "Where'd you learn that, my father?" she said, sealing the envelope. "He always said that figures don't lie, but they do stay quiet if you don't know how to ask them the right questions." Tristan thought about that. Good man. "He was," she said. "He was also bad at mortgages." A beat of silence, and then, surprising them both, Tristan made a sound that was almost a laugh. Low, brief, but genuine. She looked up. He was looking at the fire with the closest thing to an easy expression she'd seen on his face since the night she'd sat with him through the storm. She looked back down at her letter, but she held the moment for a breath before she let it go. The following week, she found the geological survey maps her father had left her and spread them on the table for the first time. She wasn't sure yet what she was looking for, but her father had marked something on the western section, a double line, running north to south beneath the ridge, annotated in his precise small handwriting, with 2 words she'd been meaning to look up. She looked them up now. Then she sat very still for a long time, looking at the map. Outside, Toby was practicing his bow against the pine trunk, and the sound of it carried in across the yard. The release, the flight, the quiet impact, regular and steady as a heartbeat. The maps took her 3 days to fully understand. That wasn't a failure of intelligence. It was a measure of how carefully her father had buried what he'd found. Surveyors who discovered something valuable on land they didn't own had to be careful in what they recorded, officially, careful in what they kept privately, careful about who might go looking through their papers after they were gone. Her father had been very careful. The official survey documents were in Oak Haven's land records office, filed properly, noting the parcel's dimensions and topography in standard language. His private maps were different. He'd used his own notation system, developed over 30 years in the field, and Corinne had grown up watching him use it without ever needing to decode it herself. Now she sat at the table with those maps spread end to end, her father's field journal open beside them, and worked through it the way he'd taught her to work through anything complex, slowly, systematically, from what she knew outward toward what she didn't. The double line running north to south beneath the ridge was a seam, coal, a natural coal deposit, running at roughly 40 feet below surface grade, beginning near the western boundary of her father's parcel and extending, based on the geological indicators, he'd mapped considerably further in both directions. The annotations around it were cautious, hedged with her father's characteristic precision. Probable depth, estimated yield, likely surface access points marked with small circles. The second annotation was the one that stopped her coal. Beneath the coal seam, fed by the same geological formation, ran a subterranean freshwater spring. Her father had traced its probable course across 6 pages of the journal. It surfaced once on the eastern slope of her parcel, once further north on land that currently fed the Upper Creek system. The Upper Creek system that supplied water to 11 ranches in the valley below. She sat with that for a long time. Then she went back to the beginning of the maps and read everything again, more slowly, making her own notes in the margins of her journal. By the time she was done, the fire had burned low, and the candle had consumed itself to a nub, and she understood exactly why Orville Buckner had targeted her father's land with such single-minded persistence. It wasn't the 40 acres. It was never the 40 acres. Whoever controlled that parcel controlled the water rights to the spring, and whoever controlled the water rights controlled the valley. She rolled the maps carefully and tied them with cord and put them back in the waterproof case her father had kept them in. Then she sat in the near dark for a while, thinking about the foreclosure notice and the marriage contract Buckner had tried to force on her and the speed with which he'd moved after her father's death. He'd known, possibly before her father died, possibly long before. She brought it to Tristan the next morning. He stood at the table and looked at the maps while she explained, walking him through the notation system and what each marking indicated. He asked 2 questions, both precise and practical. When she finished, he stood in silence for a moment, looking at the section she'd marked showing the spring's probable course. The water rights, he said. If someone held legal claim to the surface parcel, they could file for water rights to anything originating beneath it. Under territorial law, the spring would be legally theirs to control, including access fees, diversion, all of it. He looked up from the map. Every small operation in the valley depends on that creek system. Yes. He was quiet again. She had learned to read his silences. By now, this one was the calculating kind, the one where he was moving through implications and options, and likely outcomes the way he moved through terrain, methodically covering the ground. We need copies of these made, he said, and the originals somewhere safe. I was going to suggest the same thing. Does anyone else know what your father found? I don't think so. He would have told me if he'd had time. Tristan rolled the nearest map carefully and slid it back into the case. Don't take these into town. Not yet. I want Marshal Everett to know about this before Buckner gets any indication that we do. She nodded. I'll write to Everett this week. Tristan went to work. She went back to the ledgers. Toby came in from the morning chores, smelling of horse and fresh air, and ate 3 biscuits standing up before Corinne pointed at his desk, and he went to it without argument. Things continued like that for 2 more weeks, The regular rhythm of the homestead, the lessons, the cattle work, the slow accumulation of a life that was more functional than either of them had designed for. She'd stopped thinking of it in terms of the contract some time ago, though she couldn't have said exactly when. What happened on the last Thursday of July began the way disasters usually do, with something small and plausible. Tristan's hired hand, a taciturn older man named Calhoun, who came up from the valley twice a week to help with the cattle work, arrived at mid-morning with news that 3 head had been seen near the western fence line, close to the tree line drop-off. It happened occasionally. Cattle drifted, found gaps, followed grass. Tristan had ridden that line just 4 days earlier and found it intact, but 4 days was enough time. He saddled up without particular urgency. Told Corinne he'd be back before supper. Told Toby to finish the fence post repair on the south paddock and not to let the chickens out until evening. He rode west. Corinne watched him go from the porch, then went back inside to the letters she was drafting. Toby went out to the south paddock with his tools. Calhoun said he had errands in the valley and left shortly after. The afternoon was clear and warm, with a light wind coming off the mountains. She worked through 2 letters and started a third, pausing occasionally to look out the window at the yard, at the tree line, at the ordinary peaceable arrangement of a summer afternoon. She didn't hear them approach. The first thing she knew was the smell smoke, sharp and immediate, cutting through the open window. She was at the door in seconds. The barn was on fire. Not a small fire, not a spark, caught somewhere. The north end of the barn was fully alight, the old timber taking it fast, flames already climbing the side wall toward the roof line. She had time to register the deliberate nature of it. The fact that the fire was burning in 2 separate places simultaneously before she registered the men in the yard. 3 of them. She knew 2 of the faces from the day on the main street of Oakhaven. Buckner's hired hands, the ones who'd stood in a half-circle while he threatened her over her ledger. And Toby was not at the south paddock. She saw the boy being held at the edge of the yard, one of Buckner's men with a grip on his collar, Toby's feet barely touching the ground. He wasn't crying. His face was set in a controlled fury that was startling on an 11-year-old. Her rifle was inside, hanging on the peg by the bedroom door. She went back through the door and got it. When she came out, she had the Winchester up, and her feet set on the top porch step. The man holding Toby shifted his grip and put himself behind the boy, which told her everything she needed to know about how much courage he actually had. "Put him down," she said. The leader of the 3, she didn't know his name, but recognized the air of authority he wore, which meant he was Buckner's direct man, held up a hand in a gesture of mockery. "Mrs. Holt," he said, "you don't want to do something you can't undo. I could say the same to you." He smiled and reached into his coat, a folded paper. He tossed it onto the porch steps in front of her. Mr. Buckner's terms, the geological maps, and a signed deed surrender, delivered to Devil's Spine Canyon by noon Saturday. He glanced at the burning barn. The roar of it was growing now, heat pushing across the yard. He's being more than fair given the circumstances. She kept the rifle up. Her arms were steady. She'd been shooting since she was 14, had grown up carrying a rifle through survey territories, where the alternative was being defenseless, and her father had made sure she knew the difference between holding a gun and being willing to use one. She was willing, but there were 3 of them, and one of them had Toby. The leader read that calculation on her face and nodded. "Satisfied," he gestured. The man holding Toby dropped something in the dirt, a small brown cap Toby's, the one he wore every day, and then they moved, fast and organized, toward horses she hadn't seen, tied in the trees. The one holding Toby threw the boy aside as he went. Toby hit the ground and rolled and was on his feet in seconds, but they were already gone into the tree line, hoofed beats receding fast to the north. Toby ran to the porch. His lip was cut. There was blood on his collar. She lowered the rifle and put her free hand on his shoulder, checking him over rapidly the cut lip, a bruise forming on his jaw, his hand scraped from the fall. "Are you hurt anywhere else?" she asked. "No." His voice was tight and controlled and furious. They were waiting in the south tree line. "I didn't hear them until—" "It's all right, I should have." "Toby," she kept her voice level and steady, "you're here. You're standing. That's what matters right now." The barn was beyond saving. She knew that already. She got Toby back from the heat, and they stood in the yard and watched it go, the roof collapsing inward in a cascade of sparks, the sound of it enormous and consuming. She was grateful, distantly and practically, that the horses were out in the pasture, and that Tristan had designed the breezeway between barn and cabin with a gap and a fire break of packed earth that was apparently doing its job. The cabin would survive. She picked up the ransom note from the steps and read it. Then she looked at Toby's cap lying in the dirt, blood-stained at the brim, and picked that up too. She was still holding both when she heard the hoofbeats coming from the west. Tristan came through the gate at a flat gallop, and she understood that he'd seen the smoke from miles out and had been riding hard since. He brought his horses to a stop in the yard, took in the burning barn, took in her standing on the steps with the rifle, took in Toby, took in the bloodstain on the cap she was holding. He swung down. He covered the distance between them in about 4 strides, and he stopped in front of her and looked at her face, and then at Toby's. And his own face did something she'd never seen on it. Something cracked through the controlled surface of it, visible and raw, before it locked down again into something colder and more deliberate than his usual expression. His eyes went to the cap in her hands. She looked at him. Her eyes were full. She couldn't help that. She was standing in front of a burning barn holding a child's blood-stained cap, but her voice was even when she spoke. "They took him briefly," she said. "He's all right. They left a note." She held it out. "Devil's Spine Canyon, Saturday noon." The maps and the deed. Tristan took the note. "Read it." His jaw was set so hard she could see the tension in it from 2 feet away. He looked at Toby, checked the boy's injuries himself, briefly and thoroughly the way a man does who has triaged wounds before and knows what he's looking for. He put one hand on the back of Toby's neck, for just a moment not speaking, just the contact of it, and Toby stood a little straighter. Then Tristan looked at the burning barn, at the note in his hand, at Corinne, standing on the steps with her rifle and her wet eyes and her spine, straight as a fence post. He looked at her for a long moment. "Go inside," he said. "Both of you. I'll take care of the fire." She went. But she set the ransom note on the table and put her father's map case next to it. And she was already thinking about topography and canyon approaches by the time the door closed behind her. They left before first light on Saturday. Tristan's plan was straightforward in the way that good plans usually are simple enough to execute under pressure, flexible enough to survive the moment when something went wrong, because something always went wrong. 11 years of military and frontier experience had taught him that much absolutely. He spread her father's topographical maps on the table Friday night, and they worked through the canyon approach together, Corinne pointing out the features her father had marked and translating the survey notation into plain description. Devil's Spine was a limestone gorge about 8 miles north, named for the ridge of pale rock running along its eastern wall, which did look, from a distance, like vertebrae set in a line. The canyon floor was wide enough for horses, narrowing toward the north end. The approach from the main trail ran along the valley below, visible from the canyon rim, for a 1/4 mile in both directions. That was Buckner's advantage if they came the standard way. They would be seen coming, and the terms would be dictated from the high ground. "Your father mapped this section?" Tristan asked, his finger on the western slope notation. "He mapped everything." She found the relevant page in the journal. "There's a secondary approach. A ridge line running west of the canyon, maybe 400 feet above the floor." He marked it as a logging access. "Looks like someone tried to work timber up there in the 60s and gave it up. The grade is steep, but passable." Tristan studied the elevation marks. "How sure are you?" "My father's surveys were accurate to within a few feet. He staked his professional reputation on that every time he filed." He looked at the map a moment longer, then nodded. The high ridge approach would take them around the canyon entirely, coming in above and behind Buckner's position. It was the kind of move that cavalry officers spent careers learning to make deny the enemy the ground they've chosen, choose your own instead. Tristan had done it in rain and mud and darkness with men shooting at him. He could do it on a clear summer morning with one woman who could handle a rifle and the correct topographical information. They left Toby with strict instructions. Tristan sat down with the boy the evening before and told him plainly what was happening and what his job was. If they weren't back by dark, Toby was to ride Clover down the valley road to Dunnell's ranch, tell them everything, and stay there. He was not to come after them. He was not to wait past dark. These were not suggestions. Toby listened to all of it with his jaw set and his eyes serious. "All right," he said. "I mean it," Tristan said. "I know you mean it," Toby said, with the particular dignity of a child who has decided to be taken seriously. "I said, 'All right.'" Tristan held his gaze for another moment. Then he nodded. They rode out at 4 in the morning, when the sky was still fully dark and the stars were the cold, brilliant kind that come at altitude in summer. The horses moved quietly on the pine needle trail. Corinne had her Winchester across her lap and her father's map folded in her coat pocket. Tristan rode ahead, reading the trail by familiarity more than sight, taking the western fork 2 miles out that most riders passed without noticing. The ridge approach was steep. He'd warned her of that, and she'd said she could manage it. And she was right. She rode the switchbacks without complaint, leaning forward on the grade, keeping her horse calm through the loose shale sections with a steadiness that he'd stopped being surprised by some weeks ago. She was competent. He'd known that from the second day when she'd fixed the faulty draft on the kitchen stove by herself and presented him with a corrected ledger entry for the repairs before he'd even noticed she'd made them. By the time full dawn was breaking over the eastern peaks, they were on the ridge above Devil's Spine. He tied the horses back in the trees, and they moved forward on foot to the rim. Below them, the canyon floor was silver gray in the morning light, the limestone walls holding the cold of the night a little longer than the open country. Buckner's men were already there. 6 of them on the canyon floor, horses tied to a deadfall along the east wall. Tristan counted them twice, then noted their positions 2 near the south entrance, 2 at the north end of the wide section, 1 elevated on a rock shelf on the east wall, 1 staying with the horses. The one on the shelf had a rifle across his knees. He was the priority. And there, standing between 2 of Buckner's men near the center of the canyon floor, was Toby. Tristan went still. He'd planned for this. He'd told himself on the ride up that Toby would be there, that Buckner would bring him as leverage, that seeing the boy would not change the plan, because changing the plan was how people got killed. He'd planned for it. It still landed like a fist in his chest. Corinne was beside him on the rim, low and still. She'd seen Toby, too. Her face was controlled and white, and her hand on the Winchester was steady. Tristan mapped the distances, the angles, the timing. The rifleman on the shelf was elevated, but exposed. He'd be watching the south entrance, expecting them to come up the floor. The 2 holding Toby were positioned defensively, which meant they were more concerned with managing him than with fighting. The 2 at the north end were the real problem if anything broke toward a running engagement. He spoke quietly, close to her ear. "The man on the shelf, east wall. When I start moving down the north side of the ridge, I need him occupied. Not necessarily hit, occupied." She looked at the shelf, calculated the distance herself. Visibly, he could see her doing it. "That's a long no, I can make it." "I know that too." She met his eyes for a moment. "Toby's going to run toward the rocks on the west side when he has an opening. He'll know too." "How do you know that?" "Because we talked about what to do if something like this happened," she said, 2 days ago, while you were fixing the fence." He looked at her. He thought about an 11-year-old boy and a school teacher sitting down together to plan for an emergency, quietly, without drama, without burdening him with it, and a feeling moved through him that he wasn't going to examine right now. 3 minutes, he said. Then I'll be in position. He moved. The north ridge of the canyon dropped sharply through broken limestone and stands of scrub pine, and he went down it fast and quiet, in the way he'd gone through 100 similar pieces of terrain weight forward, testing each footfall, using the trees for cover and the noise of the wind through the gorge to absorb the sound of his movement. His knee protested the descent, and he ignored it. He was halfway down when he heard the shot from above. One crack of the Winchester, very clean. He heard the rifleman on the shelf shout, not in pain. The shot hadn't hit him, but close enough that the man scrambled back and lost his elevated position. That was exactly right. That was his signal. He stepped out of the tree line onto the canyon floor with his Colt already in his hand. Buckner's men, he said loudly and clearly in the enclosed space. Put your weapons on the ground. Everything happened at once, and in the particular slow-motion quality of a moment where training takes over from thought. The two men at the north end went for their guns. Tristan moved left and fired twice, not to kill, to disable, and his aim in the flat morning light of the canyon was exactly what 11 years of practice had made it. One man's gun spun away from a hand that suddenly couldn't hold it. The other dropped, struck in the shoulder, and stayed down. The two men holding Toby looked up, then looked at the rim above them, where Corinne's rifle was visible and trained, and made a rapid and sensible decision. Toby ran. He went exactly where Corinne had told him to go, flat out across the canyon floor toward the west wall, where a tumble of boulders gave cover, and he hit that cover and got behind it and stayed there without having to be told twice. The remaining men, the two at the south entrance, the rifleman now scrambling off his shelf, converged briefly, looked at the situation, and looked at Buckner's officer, who had just realized that the canyon he'd chosen for its tactical advantages had become, through a morning's careful preparation and a dead surveyor's accurate maps, a trap of his own making. Tristan kept moving. He worked through the canyon the way he'd been taught, never still, changing angle and position, keeping the remaining armed men reactive instead of planning. Above him, Corinne tracked the movement from the rim with the Winchester, covering his angles, and she fired twice more, both times at ground in front of men who were considering doing something that would have been a poor decision. And both times the discouragement was effective. The enforcer threw down his rifle. After that, the rest went quickly. When it was over, the canyon was quiet except for the wind and the groaning of the man Tristan had hit in the shoulder. 3 men disarmed and down. 2 more who'd thrown their weapons. The rifleman sitting against the east wall with his hands visible. Tristan walked to the boulder field and looked in at Toby. The boy was crouched behind the largest rock, with his knees pulled to his chest, breathing fast. He wasn't hurt. His eyes were huge and very bright, and when he saw Tristan, something in his face came loose with relief. "All right?" Tristan asked. "Yes," Toby said. "Then your plan worked." "Our plan," Tristan said. "Come out of there." Toby came out. He stood in the canyon and looked at the disarmed men and at the rim above, where Corinne was already making her way back to the horses, and he squared his shoulders with a deliberateness that was almost painful to watch. "Where's Buckner?" he asked. Tristan had been noting the same absence. "Not here," which meant Buckner had sent his men to do the work and kept himself insulated from the outcome. That was consistent with what he knew of the man. It was also a problem, because an insulated man was harder to prosecute. He looked at the disarmed men, at the canyon around them, and he thought about what Corinne had been saying since that first night at Widow Finch's boarding house, about the difference between vigilante justice and documented law, about what actually put a man like Buckner away for good versus what just gave him something to cry victim over. He thought about the affidavits they'd been carefully preparing for 3 weeks, about the fraud documents, about Marshall Everett and the circuit judge who was due in Oak Haven at the end of the month. "We're not staying here," he said. He helped the injured man to his horse because leaving a wounded man in a canyon without transport was not something he was willing to do regardless of what the man had done. And he tied the others together in a line and led them out of Devil's Spine and down the valley road toward Oakhaven. Corinne met him at the canyon entrance with both horses. She took one look at the procession, at Toby riding up behind Tristan, and at Tristan's face, and she understood the decision he'd made without having to ask. "Marshal Everett," she said. "And the circuit judge when he arrives," he said. "We do this right." She nodded. They rode for Oakhaven. The sun was fully up now, the summer morning wide and clear in every direction. The valley spread below them in all its ordinary beauty. Buckner's men rode in silence ahead. Toby rode close to Tristan and didn't say anything for a long while. Then, "She really can shoot." "Yes," Tristan said. "Did you know that before today?" "I suspected it." Toby considered this. "It's good to suspect useful things about people," he said, with the gravity of someone recording a lesson worth keeping. Tristan looked ahead at the road and said nothing. But his expression, for just a moment, was something closer to peace than she'd seen it in a long time. Corinne rode slightly behind them both, her Winchester across her lap, watching the road ahead and thinking about what happened next, about affidavits and fraud documents and a circuit judge, about a coal seam and a freshwater spring, and the 11 ranches in the valley that didn't know yet that their water had nearly been stolen, about what a person owed a community and what a community owed its children, and about the difference between a law that was bought and one that actually held. She thought about all of it, and she kept her eyes on the road and rode on. They got back to the cabin after dark. The ride down from Devil's Spine and into Oakhaven had taken most of the day delivering Buckner's men to Marshal Everett, giving preliminary statements, waiting while Everett processed the disarmed gunman with the slow, careful thoroughness of a man who knew exactly how much paperwork stood between a legitimate arrest and a case that fell apart in front of a judge. Toby had sat on the bench outside the marshal's office for 3 hours and not complained once. By the time they rode back up the ridge, the boy was asleep in the saddle again. Tristan held the reins of Toby's horse and kept pace steady. The cabin was dark when they arrived. The lantern had burned out in the window. She hadn't been there to refill it. That registered somewhere in the back of his mind as a small, specific absence. He got Toby inside and onto the bed without waking him. Corinne pulled off the boy's boots and covered him, and they moved back out to the main room and closed the bedroom door quietly behind them. Tristan lit the lamp, built up the fire. The cabin was cold from a day without heat, and the chill had settled into the walls and the floor and the surface of the table, the particular cold of a space that had been empty. Corinne got the medical kit from the shelf. She'd organized it in the first week, cataloged and restocked it, because that was what she did with things that were disordered, and set it on the table. "Sit down," she said. He sat. She'd seen the graze on his upper arm in the canyon when his coat had shifted wrong during the ride, and she'd caught the dark stain on his shirt beneath. He hadn't mentioned it. Of course he hadn't. She helped him off with the coat and rolled back his sleeve and looked at it in the lamplight. Not deep a graze, as she'd assessed, maybe 2 inches long across the outer muscle of the shoulder. It had bled considerably and then clotted, and now it needed cleaning and binding. She worked without rushing, cleaned it with the alcohol solution she'd made from what was in the kit, applied the salve, and wrapped it with clean linen. He sat perfectly still through all of it, which was its own kind of information a man accustomed to, being tended to in the field, who had learned to shut down the part of himself that registered pain because registering it wasn't useful. She tied off the bandage and set the kit aside. He was looking at the fire. She sat across the table from him and looked at his profile, the set jaw, the line of his forehead, the particular quality of stillness that was never quite the same as rest. Outside, the night was quiet. No wind, just the creek in the distance, and the occasional sound of the horses, settling in the temporary pen he'd built after the barn burned. "You rode back into that canyon for Toby," she said. "You knew what was waiting." "I knew what might be waiting," he said. "There's a difference. Not much of one." He didn't answer that. She looked at the table surface, at the grain of the wood, the small marks of daily use. "When we came up the ridge this morning," she said, "I kept thinking about what would happen if it went wrong. Not for me, for him." She meant Toby. "And I thought, this is what you feel all the time, responsible for something you can't fully protect." He turned from the fire and looked at her. "I carried men in the war," he said. "Good men. Better than me, most of them." He said it evenly, the way he said most things, but the evenness cost him something this time. She could hear the weight behind it. "You make decisions in a cavalry engagement. 60 seconds. Who goes where? Who flanks? Who holds the line? And afterward you count who came back." He paused. "I got very good at making the decisions. I never got good at the counting." She held his gaze. "I decided a long time ago," he said, "that a man like me, after the things a man like me has seen and done, doesn't get the right to want ordinary things. A home. A family." He looked at the fire again. "Wasn't a punishment. Just arithmetic." "That's the most wrong arithmetic I've ever heard," she said quietly. He looked at her. "And I've audited a great deal of bad arithmetic," she added. He was quiet for a moment. Then something shifted in his face, not breaking exactly, but releasing. Like a knot that had been pulled tight. For so long, the rope had forgotten it could lie flat. "You didn't have to stay," he said. "After the 2 years, you had options." "I know I did." He waited. She reached across the table and picked up the contract. Their 2-year agreement, folded twice, which she'd kept in her ledger since the night they'd signed it in Widow Finch's sitting room. She'd looked at it occasionally, in the early weeks, not out of doubt, but out of habit. A person who respects documents checks them from time to time. She held it for a moment. Then she leaned forward and placed it in the open hearth. The paper caught immediately, curled at the edges, the ink going brown and then black, the careful columns of terms and conditions dissolving into fire. She watched it go. So did he. "I'm not here for $250, Tristan," she said. "I am staying because of the man who built a home out of cold timber. The fire consumed the last of it. Just ash now at the edge of the coals." He sat across from her in the lamplight and looked at her for a long time, not calculating, not measuring, just looking, the way a person looks when they've stopped defending the distance between themselves and something real. He reached across the table and put his hand over hers. She turned her hand over and held his. They stayed like that for a while, by the fire in the cabin he'd built and she'd made into something more than shelter. Outside, the stars came out over Blackwood Ridge in their hundreds, and the creek ran, and the night held them without demanding anything from either of them. That was enough. It was more than enough. It was, in fact, everything. The circuit judge arrived on a Wednesday. His name was Carver, and he was a compact man from the territorial capital who wore his authority without performance and had apparently reviewed the Buckner affidavits on the overnight coach and arrived in Oakhaven with his mind mostly made up about the facts. He set up court in the largest room of the Oakhaven Town Hall, which usually served for public meetings and the occasional dance, and the town turned out in numbers that suggested most of it had been waiting a long time for this particular proceeding. Tristan and Corinne arrived early. Toby sat between them on the bench inside the hall. Marshal Everett had Buckner's remaining men in the territorial lockup, had been holding them since the canyon, and had added 3 new charges in the intervening week, as more Valley residents, emboldened by the news of the arrest, had come forward with their own documented grievances. Buckner himself had been collected from his offices 4 days after Devil's Spine, when it became clear that fleeing would only add charges to an already substantial list. He sat at the front of the hall now with his attorney in his good wool coat, with the look of a man who had not yet accepted the reality of his situation. The proceedings took most of the morning. Corinne presented the geological fraud documents clearly, and systematically, walking Judge Carver through the survey maps and the water rights implications with the same patient precision she used in the classroom, assuming intelligence, providing evidence, building the argument from fact rather than emotion. The fraud documents showing Buckner's debt manipulation went in next, followed by sworn affidavits from 11 Valley ranchers regarding water access interference, and 2 from Oak Haven merchants regarding coerced business agreements. Toby's indenture papers were entered into the record last. When they came out of the hall for the midday recess, Buckner and his attorney were immediately behind them, moving toward the hitching rail where a carriage waited. 2 of Buckner's men were at the rail, not the ones in the lockup. Different ones. Men who'd kept themselves removed from the canyon operation, and therefore remained technically free. Everything went wrong in about 4 seconds. Tristan saw it before it happened. He'd spent 11 years learning to read the moment before violence, the shift in a man's weight, the particular tension in the shoulders, the eyes that stop looking at faces and start looking at targets. All 3 of Buckner's remaining men had that look simultaneously, and Buckner's own expression had gone flat and resolved. The expression of a man who has decided that eliminating the witnesses is a cleaner solution than facing the judge. Corinne, Tristan said, very quietly. Step back. She stepped back. She took Toby with her. Buckner's man on the left drew first. Tristan was faster. He drew and fired in the single motion that a decade of daily practice had made as natural as breathing, and the gun spun out of the man's hand before it was level. The second man had his weapon halfway up when Tristan pivoted and shot it from his grip as well, not the hand, the gun itself, because a dead man created complications and a disarmed one created testimony. The third man looked at both his colleagues and at Tristan and put his hands up without being asked. The whole thing happened in front of the courthouse steps, in front of 40 witnesses, in front of Judge Carver, who had come to the door at the sound of the first shot and stood watching with the expression of a man who has seen a great deal of the frontier and finds it consistent with his prior observations. Marshal Everett had Buckner in custody before the man could speak. It was over. Corinne stood on the courthouse steps with her hand on Toby's shoulder and looked at the scene, the disarmed men, the marshal, the crowd pressed forward on both sides of the street. Then she looked at the town council members standing to the right of the steps, 3 men who had been part of Oak Haven's leadership for years, while Buckner operated under their noses. She let go of Toby's shoulder, walked to the top step. The crowd went quiet, the way crowds do when they sense someone is about to say something that needs to be heard. This frontier cannot grow, she said, clearly enough to carry to the edges of the crowd. If children are chained to ironworks instead of holding books, nor can a community stand when justice is bought and sold by the highest bidder. Nobody spoke. Every rancher in this valley almost lost their water rights to one man's greed. A child worked in chains for 4 months to pay a debt that was never legally his. These are not things that happened in secret. She looked at the council members steadily. These are things that happened in plain view, and they require plain answers going forward. She came back down the steps. Toby was looking at her with an expression that would have made her laugh on a different day, pure, uncomplicated awe, the look of a child who has just updated his understanding of what adults are capable of. Judge Carver rendered his verdict that afternoon. Buckner was remanded to the Territorial Penitentiary on 6 counts: fraud, coercion, conspiracy to commit assault, unlawful indenture of a minor, and 2 counts of interference with territorial water rights. His landholdings were ordered surveyed, and the coal and water rights placed under territorial protection, pending legislative review. Everett shook Tristan's hand outside the hall when it was done. He held it a moment, looking at him. Took guts, bringing this in through the law instead of handling it the short way. It was her idea, Tristan said. Everett looked at Corinne, who was across the street talking to 2 of the Valley ranchers who'd testified. Smart woman, he said. Yes, Tristan said. She is. By late August, Blackwood Ridge had gone golden. The meadow grass had turned from green to the warm amber of late summer, and the wild clover bloomed in drifts across the south pasture, purple and white, moving in the afternoon wind. Mountain lilies had come up along the creek bank and along the path from the cabin to the new building that was still going up on the east side of the yard, its timber frame standing clean against the sky. Tristan had broken ground on it 2 weeks after Buckner's sentencing. He hadn't announced it. He'd simply appeared one morning with lumber, and by midday the foundation posts were set. And by the end of the week, the frame was up. It was going to be one large room with 3 windows on the south wall for light, and a separate entrance from the main cabin. A good stone hearth on the west end. Pegs along the north wall for coats and bags. A schoolhouse. Corinne had stood in the frame of it, on the 3rd day, looking up at the open rafters, and hadn't said anything for a long moment. The Dunnell boy, Tristan said, measuring a rafter length, and the Morrison twins, and Toby's going to want to keep his lessons, even with the others around. You'll need room. How did you know about the Morrison twins? Their father asked me at the feed store 2 weeks ago. He marked the rafter. I told him probably yes. She looked at him. You told him probably yes. Figured. You'd say yes, he said. I told him probably to be accurate. She laughed. Full and genuine. The laugh still surprised him sometimes by appearing where he didn't expect it. 3 days a week, she said, to start. 3 days to start, he agreed. The schoolhouse was finished by mid-August. Corinne put curtains on the south windows, practical cotton, nothing fussy, and arranged the desks in the order she'd learned worked best, with Toby's in the front because he was the most advanced and she could give him independent work while attending to the newer students. Toby had changed over the summer in ways that were both obvious and hard to articulate. He was taller, which was just time, but he carried himself differently, upright, easy, with the settled confidence of a boy who knows his place in the world is secure. He helped with the cattle work every morning and took his responsibilities seriously in the specific way of someone who has been trusted with real things and found they can manage them. One afternoon in late August, Corinne was sitting on the porch in the last of the day's warmth when Tristan came up from the south pasture with Toby beside him, both of them carrying fence tools, both of them with the same dirt on their boots, and the same easy stride from a day's work done. Toby was talking. Some story from the south fence line, animated enough that he was using both hands, fence tool and all. Tristan was listening, and he said something back that made the boy laugh, and then they were at the gate. And Tristan dropped a hand briefly on Toby's shoulder, as they came through it, easy and unthought, the gesture of a man who has stopped counting the distance between himself and the people in his care. She watched them come up the yard and felt the particular fullness of a moment that is exactly what it should be. That evening, after supper, after Toby had gone to his desk to work on the composition she'd assigned, Tristan sat in his chair by the hearth with one of her books in his hands. She was across from him with the accounts, half listening to the fire, half listening to the scratch of Toby's pen on paper in the bedroom. She looked up. Tristan was reading. Not tracking words with his finger, not mouthing them silently, reading, his eyes moving across the page at the pace of understanding. He turned a page, kept going. She looked back at her accounts. She was smiling at the page, though she kept that to herself. A few minutes later, he read something aloud. His voice was quiet and deliberate, sounding out the sentences with care but without struggle. She listened to the passage, something from the natural history book she'd brought from the library, describing the migration of elk across mountain territories. When he finished, he looked up. She met his eyes. "You're reading well," she said. "Getting there," he said, which from him meant the same as pride. Outside, the lantern burned in the front window, as it did every night now. Its light reached the porch and the yard and the new schoolhouse frame, touching everything with that particular amber warmth that changes the character of the dark around it. Corinne set her accounts aside and leaned back in her chair. She was tired in the comfortable way of a day fully spent, and she was aware, in a way she hadn't been aware of much in the months since her father died, of being exactly where she was supposed to be. Tristan set the book on the arm of his chair and looked at the lantern light through the window. She rested her head against his shoulder. He didn't move, just settled, the way a man settles when something fits. She had just started to tell him that the accounts were showing a good season when he spoke. First, quietly, more to himself than to her. "I rode into town just looking for flour and cartridges," he said. His voice was low and certain, and it carried the particular weight of a man who has thought about something for a long time before saying it. "But Providence gave me an unexpected bride who changed my entire world forever." She was quiet for a moment. Outside, the lantern burned on. Somewhere in the bedroom, Toby's pen stopped scratching and then started again, and the creek ran below the ridge as it always had, and the mountain lilies were still open in the last of the evening warmth. Corinne Holt took her husband's hand and held it, and let the night be what it was. Everything, and enough. This is a work of pure fiction. All characters and events are entirely the product of the author's imagination. Any resemblance to real persons or actual events is completely unintentional.